In the unforgiving desert of 1880s Arizona, where the line between life and death was drawn in sand and blood, one man's decision to save two Apache sisters would ignite a chain of events that no one could have predicted. What started as an act of mercy would become a test of honor that reached the highest levels of Apache leadership, challenging everything both cultures believed about loyalty, justice, and the price of doing what's right. This is not just a story of survival. It's the true account of how a simple rancher's choice rippled through history, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can alter the course of destiny itself. The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Samuel Torres as he guided his horse through the rocky terrain near his ranch. It was late afternoon in August 1883, and the heat shimmered off the desert floor like ghostly dancers. Samuel had been checking on his scattered cattle when he spotted something unusual near a cluster of mesquite trees about half a mile from his property line. As he rode closer, his weathered hands tightened on the reins. Two young Apache women lay collapsed in the sparse shade, their clothes torn and faces streaked with dirt and dried blood. One appeared to be in her early 20s, the other perhaps 16. Both were unconscious, their lips cracked from severe dehydration. Samuel's heart raced. Relations between settlers and the Apache had been tense for years, with raids and retaliations creating an atmosphere of constant fear. Most ranchers in the territory would have ridden away, reporting the sighting to the cavalry post 20 miles south. But something about the sight of these two defenseless women stirred something deep within Samuel's conscience. He dismounted carefully, his boots crunching on the gravelly ground. The older woman stirred slightly as a shadow fell across her face. Her eyes fluttered open, dark, and filled with pain and mistrust. She tried to sit up, her hand reaching protectively toward the younger woman beside her. Samuel raised his hand slowly, showing he was unarmed. He pulled his canteen from his saddle and offered it to her. The woman's eyes darted between his face and the water, her internal struggle visible. Thirst won over caution, and she accepted the canteen with trembling hands, drinking deeply before gently lifting her sister's head to share the precious water. Through broken English and gestures, Samuel learned their names were Ayanna and Itzel. They had been traveling for 3 days without food or water, fleeing from something that had left them both injured and terrified. Ayanna, the older sister, had a deep gash on her arm that was beginning to fester. Itzel had what appeared to be a severe ankle injury that prevented her from walking. Samuel faced a decision that would change his life forever. His ranch was isolated, miles from the nearest neighbor. His wife Maria had died 2 years earlier, leaving him alone with their teenage son Carlos. Taking in 2 Apache women would be seen as treason by many in the territory. The cavalry regularly patrolled the area, and harboring Apache could result in charges of aiding the enemy. Yet as he looked at these 2 vulnerable women, Samuel saw only human beings in desperate need. His Catholic upbringing had taught him about mercy and compassion. His late wife Maria had often reminded him that kindness was a choice that defined a person's character more than wealth or status ever could. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Samuel knew that leaving them here meant certain death. The desert was unforgiving, and their injuries required immediate attention. Wild animals would be drawn by the scent of blood once darkness fell. He made his choice. Samuel helped Ayanna to her feet, supporting her weight as she limped to his horse. Then he carefully lifted Itzel, who had regained consciousness but remained weak. The younger woman's dark eyes held a mixture of fear and gratitude as Samuel secured her in front of him on the saddle. Ayanna walked alongside the horse, her hand occasionally touching Samuel's leg in a gesture of trust that surprised them both. The journey to the ranch took nearly an hour. Samuel's modest adobe home sat in a valley surrounded by low hills, with a barn, a few outbuildings, and corrals for his horses and cattle. A windmill turned lazily in the evening breeze, drawing water from a well his father had dug 20 years earlier when the family first claimed this land. Carlos was in the barn tending to the animals when his father returned. The 17-year-old froze when he saw the two Apache women, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle he always kept nearby when working alone. Samuel called out in Spanish, telling his son to put down the weapon and help him get the women inside. Carlos hesitated, his young face showing the confusion and fear that had been ingrained in him through years of stories about Apache raids. But respect for his father overrode his apprehension, and he rushed to help. They brought the women into the main room of the house, where Samuel's late wife had created a warm, welcoming space with hand-woven blankets and simple wooden furniture. Samuel lit several oil lamps as darkness began to fall, then set about tending to their guests' injuries. He cleaned Ayanna's arm wound with whiskey, causing her to wince, but remain stoic. The cut was deep but clean, and Samuel was able to stitch it closed with a needle and thread Maria had used for mending clothes. Itzel's ankle was severely swollen, possibly broken. Samuel wrapped it carefully with strips of cloth, elevating it on a pillow from his own bed. Throughout the evening, as Samuel prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and dried beef, he noticed how the sisters communicated with each other through quiet words in Apache and meaningful glances. Their bond was clearly strong, and Ayanna's protective instincts toward Itzel were evident in every gesture. Carlos remained wary, but followed his father's lead, bringing fresh water and helping to make the women comfortable. As the night progressed, Samuel began to piece together more of their story through Ayanna's limited English and dramatic gestures. They were not just any Apache women. Ayanna revealed that they were the daughters of a respected war chief named Nailnish, known to whites as Red Hawk. Their father led a band that had so far avoided forced relocation to the San Carlos Reservation, maintaining their traditional lifestyle in the remote mountains of southeastern Arizona. The sisters had been kidnapped 3 weeks earlier by a group of Mexican bandits who had been raiding both Apache camps and settler homesteads. The bandits had planned to sell them to traders who dealt in human trafficking across the border. But Ayanna and Itzel had managed to escape during a thunderstorm, stealing a horse and riding north toward their homeland. Their horse had collapsed and died 2 days into their journey, leaving them to continue on foot across the brutal desert terrain. They had been surviving on cactus fruit and muddy water from rare puddles when Samuel found them. As the women rested, Samuel sat on his porch, smoking his pipe and contemplating the magnitude of what he had done. In the morning, he would need to decide what came next. He could not keep them hidden indefinitely. His nearest neighbor, a rancher named William Garrett, was known for his hatred of all Apache and would not hesitate to alert the cavalry if he discovered what Samuel had done. The territorial government had placed a bounty on Apache warriors, and while it did not officially extend to women and children, many settlers and soldiers made no distinction. The policy was clear. All Apache were to be captured and sent to reservations or eliminated as threats to territorial security. Samuel's thoughts turned to his son Carlos, whose future was tied to this land and this community. Was he putting his boy at risk by harboring these women? What would Maria have advised him to do? As if sensing his internal struggle, Ayana appeared in the doorway. She moved carefully, favoring her injured arm, but her posture was dignified despite her circumstances. In the soft lamplight, Samuel could see the intelligence and strength in her eyes. She spoke quietly in Apache, then switched to English. "Why you help us?" Samuel considered the question carefully. "Because it was the right thing to do," he finally answered. Ayana nodded slowly. "My people, we remember kindness. We remember those who show honor." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching in the distance. Samuel's blood turned cold as he recognized the deliberate pace of military mounts. Through the darkness, he could make out the silhouettes of at least 4 riders heading directly toward his ranch. Samuel quickly motioned for Ayana to get back inside and hide with her sister. He grabbed his rifle from beside the door, not to threaten the approaching riders, but to appear like any other rancher protecting his property during a nighttime visit. The riders came to a halt about 30 feet from the house. In the moonlight, Samuel could see they were cavalry soldiers led by a sergeant he recognized from previous encounters. Sergeant McKenzie was a career soldier who had been fighting Apache for over a decade, and his reputation for ruthlessness was well known throughout the territory. "Evening, Torres," McKenzie called out, not dismounting. "We're tracking some Apache that escaped from a skirmish yesterday near Tucson. 2 women, 1 wounded. You seen anything suspicious?" Samuel's mouth went dry, but he kept his voice steady. "Haven't seen any Apache, Sergeant. Been working my cattle all day." Mackenzie's eyes scanned the ranch buildings, noting the lamplight in the house. "Mind if we take a look around? Orders are to search every homestead between here and the border." This was the moment Samuel had been dreading. Refusing would be tantamount to an admission of guilt, but allowing the search meant certain discovery of Ayana and each cell. He could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "Of course, Sergeant, but my son's been feeling poorly, so I'd appreciate if you could keep it quiet." Mackenzie nodded and signaled for his men to spread out. 2 soldiers headed toward the barn while Mackenzie and another trooper approached the house. Samuel's mind raced, trying to think of where the women could possibly hide that would not be discovered in a thorough search. As they reached the front door, Samuel heard a sound that made his heart stop, a soft cough from inside the house. Mackenzie heard it too, his hand immediately moving to his sidearm. "That your boy?" the sergeant asked, his voice suddenly sharp with suspicion. Samuel nodded, hoping his expression remained calm. "Carlos. Like I said, he's been under the weather." Mackenzie pushed past Samuel into the house, his eyes adjusting to the lamplight as he scanned the room. Samuel followed, his pulse pounding so hard he was certain the sergeant could hear it. The main room appeared empty except for the furniture and the remnants of the evening meal. Mackenzie moved toward the back of the house where the bedrooms were located. Samuel knew that if the women were discovered, there would be no explanation that could save him from charges of treason. Just as Mackenzie reached for the door handle of the back bedroom, Carlos appeared from the side room, rubbing his eyes and looking genuinely ill. The young man's face was flushed, and he swayed slightly as if weak from fever. "Papa, what's happening?" Carlos asked in Spanish, his voice hoarse and confused. Mackenzie studied the young man carefully, noting his apparent sickness. After a moment, he stepped back from the bedroom door. "Sorry to disturb you, son. We're looking for some dangerous Apache. Your father says you haven't seen anything." Carlos shook his head, coughing into his hand. "No, sir. Been sleeping most of the day." The sergeant continued his inspection of the main room, checking behind furniture and examining the kitchen area. Samuel watched every movement, knowing that any sign of the women's presence would doom them all. After what felt like an eternity, Mackenzie headed back toward the door. "Looks clean in here. My boys are finishing up outside, then we'll be moving on." Samuel walked with him to the porch, struggling to appear casual. A few minutes later, the other soldiers returned from searching the barn and outbuildings, reporting nothing suspicious. As the cavalry unit prepared to leave, Mackenzie turned back to Samuel one final time. "Torres, you know the penalty for harboring Apache hostiles, don't you?" Samuel met the sergeant's gaze steadily. "Ido, Sergeant, but I'm just a rancher trying to make an honest living." Mackenzie studied him for a long moment, then mounted his horse. "We'll be patrolling this area regularly. If you do see anything, you send word to the fort immediately. The territorial governor wants these women caught and brought in for questioning." After the soldiers rode away, Samuel waited a full hour before going back inside. He found Ayanna and Itzel huddled together in a small storage closet behind barrels of grain, where they had hidden when they heard the horses approaching. Carlos had helped conceal them while pretending to be sick, his quick thinking potentially saving all their lives. As dawn approached, Samuel realized that the cavalry's visit had changed everything. They were actively hunting for these specific women, which meant keeping them at the ranch was no longer possible. But where could they go? The desert was still deadly, their injuries had not fully healed, and they had no supplies for an extended journey. Ayanna seemed to understand their predicament. As the first light of morning began to filter through the windows, she spoke quietly to Samuel about her father, Chief Red Hawk. She explained that his band was camped somewhere in the Dragoon Mountains, about 60 miles to the southeast. If they could reach him, the women would be safe. But the journey would be treacherous. The cavalry would be patrolling all the likely routes, and the desert between the ranch and the mountains was some of the most unforgiving terrain in the territory. Samuel would need to make another impossible choice: send them to almost certain death in the desert, or risk his own life by helping them reach safety. Samuel spent the entire morning wrestling with his conscience. The smart thing would be to give Ayanna and Itzel some supplies and send them on their way, hoping they could somehow reach their father's camp alive. But deep down, he knew that their chances of survival were slim. Itzel's ankle was still severely injured, and Ayanna's arm wound, while cleaned and stitched, would limit her ability to help her sister through the challenging terrain ahead. By midday, Samuel had made his decision. He would guide them himself as far as the Dragoon Mountains, using his knowledge of the desert and hidden water sources to increase their chances of survival. It was a risk that could cost him everything, but leaving them to die was not an option his conscience could bear. Carlos was appalled when his father explained the plan. The young man had grown up hearing stories about Apache raids and the brutal warfare that had plagued the territory for decades. His mother's own brother had been killed in an Apache attack 5 years earlier, and Carlos struggled to reconcile his family's history with his father's compassionate decision. "Papa, this is madness," Carlos said in rapid Spanish as they stood outside the house. "These are Apache women. What if this is some kind of trap? What if their father uses them to lure settlers into an ambush?" Samuel understood his son's fears, but he had looked into Ayanna's eyes and seen genuine gratitude, not deception. Sometimes, Mijo, we must choose between what is safe and what is right. Your mother always believed that kindness would return to us tenfold. Carlos shook his head, but did not argue further. He had learned to trust his father's judgment, even when it seemed to defy common sense. "If you're determined to do this, then I'm going with you." Samuel firmly refused. The journey would be dangerous enough without risking his son's life as well. Carlos would stay at the ranch, maintaining the appearance of normal activity in case the cavalry returned. If Samuel did not come back within a week, Carlos was to assume the worst and make his own decisions about the future of their property. That evening, Samuel began preparing for the journey. He selected his strongest horse, a sturdy mare named Luna, who had proven her endurance in previous desert crossings. He packed enough food and water for 4 people for 5 days, along with basic medical supplies and ammunition for his rifle. He also gathered items that might be useful for trading or as gifts: blankets, tobacco, and a small pouch of silver coins. If they encountered other Apache along the way, these offerings might mean the difference between safe passage and violent confrontation. Ayanna watched these preparations with growing understanding of the sacrifice Samuel was making. She approached him as he checked his saddle and gear, speaking in careful English supplemented by hand gestures. "You risk much for strangers," she said. "My father, he will want to know why white man shows such honor." Samuel paused in his work. "Tell him that not all white men are the same, just as not all Apache are the same. Tell him that some of us still believe in doing what is right, regardless of the cost." Ayanna nodded solemnly. "I will tell him, and I will tell him that Samuel Torres showed mercy when he could have chosen to look away." They departed before dawn on the 3rd day, while stars still dotted the sky and the air held the coolness of night. Samuel helped Itzel mount Luna, then positioned himself to walk alongside the horse. Ayanna insisted on walking despite her arm wound, claiming that her injuries were not severe enough to warrant riding while their benefactor traveled on foot. The first part of their journey took them southeast across relatively flat desert terrain dotted with sagebrush and occasional stands of mesquite. Samuel set a steady but conservative pace, knowing that they had over 50 miles to cover and that speed would be useless if they exhausted themselves or their horse in the first day. As the sun rose, the landscape around them came alive with the subtle beauty of the desert. Coyotes called to each other in the distance, and roadrunners darted between the brush, chasing lizards and insects. But Samuel remained focused on the horizon, watching for any signs of cavalry patrols or other travelers who might report their presence. Around mid-morning, they encountered their first potential obstacle. A dust cloud appeared in the distance, moving roughly parallel to their path. Samuel immediately led them toward a rocky outcropping that offered concealment, helping Itzel down from the horse and positioning everyone behind the largest boulder. Through his spyglass, Samuel could make out a group of 6 riders moving at a steady pace about 2 miles away. They appeared to be cavalry, probably another patrol searching for the Apache sisters. The group passed without changing direction, but the encounter reminded everyone of how precarious their situation remained. As they continued south, the terrain began to change. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills covered with ocotillo and prickly pear cactus. The temperature climbed steadily, and Samuel was grateful for the wide-brimmed hat that protected his face from the scorching sun. During their midday rest in the shade of a large boulder, Ayanna began to share more details about her family and their current situation. Her father, Chief Red Hawk, was one of the last Apache leaders to resist relocation to the reservations. His band consisted of about 40 warriors and their families who had been living a precarious existence in the remote mountains, avoiding both cavalry patrols and bounty hunters. The Mexican bandits who had captured Ayanna and Itzel had been tracking Apache movements for months, looking for opportunities to kidnap women and children for the slave trade that still operated across the border. Red Hawk had been searching for his daughters since they disappeared, and Ayana was certain that he would have scouts watching all the approaches to the Dragoon Mountains. This information both encouraged and worried Samuel. The presence of Apache scouts meant that their arrival would likely be detected and reported, but it also meant that Red Hawk was actively in the area and could be reached. The challenge would be making contact without being mistaken for enemies or threats. As afternoon turned to evening, they faced their first serious challenge. A flash flood had washed out the normal crossing point of a seasonal creek, leaving steep banks and rushing water that would be dangerous for Eatzel in her weakened condition. Samuel spent an hour searching for an alternative crossing before finding a spot where fallen trees had created a natural bridge. The crossing was treacherous. Samuel went first, testing the stability of the makeshift bridge, then helped guide Luna carefully across. Ayana crossed next, her injured arm making balance difficult on the wet, slippery wood. Finally, Samuel carried Eatzel across in his arms, moving step by careful step while Ayana waited on the far side, ready to help if needed. That night, they made camp in a sheltered canyon where Samuel felt confident they could have a small fire without being detected. As he prepared a simple meal of dried meat, beans, and coffee, he noticed how Ayana had begun to relax around him. The initial wariness in her eyes had been replaced by something approaching trust, and she even smiled when he attempted to communicate with hand gestures when words failed. Eatzel remained more reserved, perhaps due to her younger age or the trauma of their recent captivity. But she accepted Samuel's help with quiet dignity, and he could see the intelligence in her dark eyes as she watched everything around them with the alertness of someone who had learned that survival depended on constant vigilance. During the evening, as they sat around the small fire, Ayana began to tell Samuel about Apache traditions and beliefs. She spoke about the importance of honor and reciprocity in her culture, and how acts of kindness created bonds that transcended tribal or racial boundaries. Samuel found himself fascinated by her perspective on life and her descriptions of Apache spiritual practices. In return, Samuel shared stories about his late wife Maria and the dreams they had shared for their ranch. He talked about his hopes for Carlos's future and his struggles to build a life in this harsh but beautiful landscape. Despite the language barriers, a genuine connection was forming between them. The second day of travel brought them into more mountainous terrain. The rocky slopes provided better concealment, but made the journey more difficult for Eatzel, whose ankle continued to cause her significant pain. Samuel fashioned a makeshift crutch from a sturdy piece of wood, which helped her maintain better balance during the frequent dismounting that the rough terrain required. Around noon, they had their first encounter with Apache scouts. Samuel was refilling their water containers at a natural spring when Ayana suddenly grabbed his arm and pointed toward a ridge about a quarter-mile away. Two figures on horseback sat motionless against the skyline, clearly watching their party. Ayana called out in Apache, her voice carrying across the desert air. The response came immediately, a series of calls and whistles that Samuel could not understand, but that clearly meant something significant to both sisters. The tension in Ayana's posture relaxed, and she turned to Samuel with relief evident in her expression. "My father's scouts," she explained. "They will carry word that we approach." The scouts disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, but Samuel knew that from this point forward, their movements were being carefully monitored by eyes they could not see. It was both reassuring and intimidating to know that Apache warriors were watching their every step. Late in the afternoon, they encountered a more immediate danger. A group of prospectors had made camp near a water source that Samuel had planned to use for their evening stop. The three rough-looking men were armed and clearly suspicious of any travelers in this remote area where Apache raids were a constant threat. Samuel made the difficult decision to approach the camp directly rather than try to sneak past. A friendly greeting and casual conversation might allow them to refill their water and continue without arousing suspicion, while any attempt at concealment would likely result in violence if they were discovered. He instructed Ayanna and Eatsel to wait behind a rock formation while he rode into the prospector's camp alone. The men greeted him with a mixture of caution and relief, happy to see another white face, but wary of what his presence might mean. Samuel spun a careful story about tracking lost cattle toward the Mexican border, explaining his presence in the area without mentioning his companions. The prospectors shared their coffee and complained about the dangers of working in Apache territory, describing several recent encounters with hostile Indians that had forced them to abandon promising claims. After an hour of carefully maintaining his cover story, Samuel was able to refill his water containers and purchase some additional supplies from the prospectors. As he prepared to leave, one of the men offered a warning that made his blood run cold. "Watch yourself out there, friend," the grizzled prospector said. "Word is there's a big Apache war party moving through these mountains. Chief Red Hawk himself, they say. Army's mobilizing every available unit to track him down." Samuel maintained his casual demeanor while his mind raced with the implications. If the army was actively pursuing Red Hawk's band, their journey had become far more dangerous. Military units would be converging on the Dragoon Mountains from multiple directions, turning the entire area into a potential battlefield. He thanked the prospectors for their warning and rode back to where Ayanna and Eatsel waited. When he shared the news about the army's movements, Ayanna's face showed a mixture of concern and determination. Her father was in greater danger than they had realized, and reaching him quickly had become even more critical. They pushed hard through the evening, covering more ground than Samuel had originally planned. The sisters seemed to draw strength from the knowledge that they were close to safety, and even Eatsel managed to endure the discomfort of her injured ankle without complaint. As darkness fell, they found themselves in the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains. The rocky peaks loomed above them like ancient sentinels, their surfaces carved by countless years of wind and weather into fantastic shapes and hidden canyons. Somewhere in these mountains, Red Hawk and his people were making their stand against the inevitable tide of American expansion. Samuel made camp in a secluded canyon where a small stream provided fresh water and shelter from the wind. As he prepared what might be their last meal together, he reflected on the remarkable journey they had shared. In just 2 days, he had formed a connection with these Apache women that transcended the racial and cultural barriers that divided their peoples. But tomorrow would bring the greatest challenge yet. They would need to locate Red Hawk's band while avoiding the army units that were searching for the same target. Samuel would need to trust that his act of mercy would be recognized and respected by Apache warriors who had every reason to distrust white men. As he lay down to sleep under the star-filled desert sky, Samuel wondered if he would ever see his ranch or his son again. The choice he had made to help 2 strangers had led him far from home and into the heart of a conflict that had been raging for decades. Tomorrow would determine whether his faith in human decency had been justified or whether it would cost him everything he held dear. Dawn broke over the Dragoon Mountains with the promise of another scorching day, but Samuel barely noticed the rising temperature. His attention was focused entirely on the wall of stone that rose before them, searching for any sign of a path that might lead to Red Hawk's hidden stronghold. The mountains seemed impenetrable, a natural fortress that had sheltered Apache bands for generations. Ayanna had been quiet since they broke camp, her eyes constantly scanning the rocky slopes above them. Samuel could sense her tension as they drew closer to her father's territory. Despite their growing trust, she knew that bringing a white man into the heart of Apache resistance was unprecedented and potentially dangerous for everyone involved. Around mid-morning, their decision about which route to take was made for them. A group of 6 Apache warriors materialized from behind rock formations that Samuel would have sworn were empty moments before. They moved with the fluid grace of men completely at home in this harsh environment, their weapons ready, but not immediately threatening. The leader was a man in his 30s with intricate tattoos on his chest and arms and scars that spoke of numerous battles. He rode a paint horse with the easy confidence of someone who had been born in the saddle. His dark eyes fixed on Samuel with an intensity that made the rancher acutely aware that his life hung in the balance of the next few moments. Ayanna rode forward and began speaking rapidly in Apache, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. The warrior leader listened without expression, his gaze never leaving Samuel's face. The conversation continued for several minutes, with gestures towards Samuel and heated exchanges that suggested disagreement among the warriors. Finally, the leader held up his hand for silence. He studied Samuel for a long moment, then spoke in accented but clear English. "I am Cochise, war leader under Chief Red Hawk. My chief's daughters say you have shown great honor, but bringing a white man to our sanctuary violates every law of survival our people know." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "You will come with us, but know that your fate rests entirely in my chief's hands." Samuel nodded, understanding that he had passed beyond the point where his own actions could influence the outcome. He had committed himself to this path when he first offered water to 2 dying women in the desert, and now he would see where that choice led. The journey into the mountains was unlike anything Samuel had ever experienced. The Apache warriors led them along paths that seemed to exist only in the minds of those who knew where to look. They traversed narrow ledges that dropped hundreds of feet into rocky canyons, crossed streams that ran through caves carved deep into mountainsides, and climbed slopes so steep that Samuel often found himself leading Luna rather than riding her. But what impressed him most was the system of sentries and communication that the Apache maintained. Throughout their ascent, Samuel spotted warriors positioned on high points where they could observe all approaches to the mountain stronghold. Signals were passed using mirrors that reflected sunlight in coded flashes, and bird calls that sounded natural to Samuel's ears, but clearly carried messages to Apache ears. After 3 hours of steady climbing, they reached a plateau that opened into a hidden valley. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as he saw the Apache encampment spread below them. More than 40 families had created a temporary village in this mountain sanctuary, with traditional brush shelters arranged in family groups around central fire pits. The scene was both peaceful and warlike. Children played between the shelters while women worked on various tasks, but Samuel could see armed warriors stationed at strategic points around the valley's perimeter. Horses grazed in a natural meadow fed by a clear mountain stream, and smoke from cooking fires rose into the thin mountain air. As their party descended into the valley, Samuel noticed that all activity gradually stopped. Men, women, and children turned to stare at the unprecedented sight of a white man being escorted into their most secret refuge. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion or open hostility. Samuel felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, each person making their own judgment about this stranger who had somehow earned safe passage to their hidden sanctuary. At the center of the encampment stood a larger shelter that was clearly the dwelling of someone important. As they approached, Samuel saw him for the first time. Chief Red Hawk, the legendary Apache leader whose raids and resistance had made him one of the most wanted men in the territory. Red Hawk was not what Samuel had expected. Rather than a savage warrior depicted in newspaper accounts, the chief appeared to be a man in his 50s with intelligent eyes and a bearing that spoke of natural authority tempered by wisdom. His clothing was simpler than that of his warriors, but every gesture and movement commanded immediate respect from those around him. The chief emerged from his shelter as the party approached, his eyes immediately seeking out his daughters. The reunion was touching in its restraint. Ayanna dismounted and walked toward her father with quiet dignity, while Itzel slid down from Luna's back and limped forward on her makeshift crutch. Red Hawk embraced both daughters briefly, but warmly, his relief evident despite his controlled demeanor. Then, his attention turned to Samuel, and the rancher found himself being studied by one of the most formidable men he had ever encountered. Red Hawk's gaze seemed to penetrate to Samuel's very soul, weighing his character and intentions with the skill of someone whose survival had depended on reading people accurately for decades. Ayanna spoke to her father in Apache, her words tumbling out in a rapid account of their rescue and journey. Samuel caught occasional English words mixed in her narrative, but mostly he simply waited, knowing that his fate was being decided in a language he could not understand. Other members of the band gathered around them in a loose circle. Samuel saw elderly men who were clearly respected advisors, middle-aged warriors who watched him with professional assessment of his potential as threat or ally, and women whose faces showed the same protective concern for their families that Samuel had seen in his late wife's eyes when danger threatened. When Ayanna finished her account, Red Hawk spoke briefly with his war leaders, their consultation conducted in voices too low for Samuel to hear, even if he could have understood the words. The discussion seemed heated at times, with gestures towards Samuel that suggested disagreement about how to handle this unprecedented situation. Finally, Red Hawk stepped forward and addressed Samuel directly in English that was more precise than his war leader coachises. "Samuel Torres," the chief said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute leadership. "My daughters tell me that you risked everything to save their lives and guide them home safely. They say you showed honor when you could have chosen safety, mercy when you could have chosen to look away." Samuel inclined his head respectfully. "I did what any decent man would do, Chief Red Hawk. Your daughters needed help, and I was able to provide it." Red Hawk studied him for a moment. "You speak of decency, but most men of your people would have seen Apache women and thought only of reward, money, or revenge for past grievances. Why are you different?" The question went to the heart of everything Samuel believed about right and wrong. "Because I judge people by their actions, not their bloodline. Your daughters were in need, and helping them was the right thing to do. My late wife always taught me that kindness creates bonds that transcend the differences between people." A murmur went through the gathered Apache at this response. Samuel could not tell if their reaction was positive or negative, but he sensed that his words had been carefully weighed by everyone present. Red Hawk nodded slowly. "Your wife was a wise woman, but wisdom and reality are often enemies in times of war." He gestured toward the mountains around them. "At this moment, 3 columns of soldiers are converging on these mountains, seeking to capture or kill my people. They bring Gatling guns and howitzers to blast us from our strongholds. Many of them were the scalps of Apache children on their belts. The chief's voice hardened as he continued. These soldiers serve the same government that you serve by paying taxes and following laws. How can I trust a man whose people have declared war on everything I hold sacred? Samuel felt the weight of centuries of conflict in Red Hawk's words, but he also heard the genuine question beneath the accusation. This was not rhetoric, but a test of whether Samuel truly understood the implications of his actions. I can't speak for my government or my people as a whole, Samuel replied carefully. I can only speak for myself and my choices. I chose to help your daughters because they were human beings in need, not because of their race or their father's reputation. I guided them here because I gave my word, and a man's word is all he truly owns. Red Hawk exchanged glances with his advisors, then turned back to Samuel. You say you judge people by their actions. Let me tell you about my actions. Samuel Torres. Last month, soldiers attacked a peaceful Apache camp near the San Carlos Reservation. They killed 17 people, including women and children who were gathering acorns for winter food. The newspapers in your territory called this a glorious victory over hostile savages. The chief's voice remained level, but Samuel could see the pain in his eyes. I have been fighting your people for 20 years, but I have never killed a woman or child. I have never attacked those who could not defend themselves. Yet I am called a savage, while the soldiers who murder innocents are called heroes. Samuel felt the full weight of the injustices that had shaped Red Hawk's worldview. He knew that everything the chief said was likely true, and that similar atrocities had been committed throughout the territory. The cycle of violence had created wounds that might never heal. I can't defend those actions, Samuel said quietly, and I won't try to justify what cannot be justified. All I can tell you is that not all white men approve of such things. Some of us believe that how we treat others defines who we are as people. Red Hawk studied him for a long moment, then surprised everyone by asking an unexpected question. Do you have children, Samuel Torres? A son, Carlos. He's 17. And if Apache warriors came to your ranch and threatened your son, what would you do? Samuel understood that this was the crucial question, the one that would determine whether he was seen as naive idealist or someone who genuinely understood the complexities of their situation. I would protect my son with my life, Samuel answered without hesitation, just as you protect your people with yours. The difference is that I would not seek revenge against Apache children for the actions of Apache warriors, just as I hope you would not blame my son for the actions of soldiers he has never met. A long silence followed Samuel's response. Red Hawk turned and walked a few steps away, his eyes focused on the mountains that surrounded their hidden valley. Samuel waited, knowing that his life and future hung on whatever decision the Apache chief was reaching. Finally, Red Hawk returned and addressed not just Samuel but the entire gathered band. He spoke in Apache for several minutes, his voice carrying the authority of absolute leadership. Samuel watched the faces around him, trying to gauge their reaction to whatever the chief was saying. When Red Hawk finished speaking in Apache, he turned back to Samuel. I have told my people that you will stay with us as our guest for 3 days. During that time, you will see how we live and why we fight. You will understand what your government seeks to destroy when it talks of pacification and progress. The chief paused, his eyes boring into Samuel's. At the end of 3 days, you will be free to leave and return to your ranch and your son. But you will also be given a choice that will determine not just your fate, but the fate of my daughters who owe you their lives. Samuel felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. What kind of choice? Red Hawk's expression was unreadable. In 3 days, Samuel Torres, you will have the chance to prove that your compassion extends beyond individual acts of mercy. You will have the opportunity to stand with justice or stand with your people. But know this, once you make that choice, there will be no going back. Your life will be forever changed, just as helping my daughters has already changed it. As the chief's words sank in, Samuel realized that his act of mercy in the desert had set in motion events that were far larger than he had imagined. He had sought only to save 2 lives, but now he found himself at the center of a conflict that would test everything he believed about right and wrong. The next 3 days would reveal not just the truth about the Apache way of life, but the truth about his own character and the depth of his commitment to the principles he claimed to hold dear. Whatever choice awaited him, Samuel knew that the man who left this mountain valley would be fundamentally different from the rancher who had stumbled upon 2 dying women in the desert. Samuel's first night in the Apache camp was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He was given a place to sleep near the shelter of an elderly warrior named Geronimo's brother, who had been assigned to watch over him. The man, called Nedney, spoke little English, but communicated through gestures and expressions that conveyed both caution and curiosity about this unexpected guest. As darkness fell over the mountain valley, Samuel discovered that Apache camp life continued with activities that contradicted every stereotype he had heard about these people. Children played games that reminded him of hide and seek while their mothers worked on intricate beadwork by firelight. Warriors maintained their weapons with the same careful attention Samuel gave to his ranch tools, and elders gathered to share stories that seemed to serve as both entertainment and education. What struck Samuel most powerfully was the sense of community that pervaded everything. Despite living under constant threat of military attack, these people had created a society based on cooperation and mutual support. Food was shared freely among families, with no one going hungry while others had plenty. Children were welcomed and protected by all adults, not just their parents. Decisions were made through consultation rather than arbitrary authority. On his second day, Red Hawk arranged for Samuel to witness aspects of Apache life that few white men had ever seen. He was invited to observe a council meeting where warriors debated their response to the approaching army columns. The discussion was passionate but respectful, with each man allowed to speak his mind without interruption. Samuel learned that the Apache were not the bloodthirsty savages portrayed in territorial newspapers, but thoughtful people facing impossible choices. They knew that continued resistance would likely lead to their destruction, but they also knew that surrender meant the slow death of their culture on reservations where their children would be forbidden to speak their language or practice their religion. During the council, Samuel heard accounts of atrocities committed by both sides in the ongoing conflict. Apache warriors described villages burned by cavalry, women and children shot while trying to flee, and prisoners executed after surrendering. But he also heard Apache leaders acknowledge raids on settlers who had shown no hostility toward them. And he began to understand how the cycle of violence had escalated beyond anyone's ability to control. Cochise, the war leader who had first escorted Samuel into the mountains, approached him after the council meeting. The Apache warrior had been studying Samuel throughout the discussions, and now he seemed ready to test the white man's understanding of their situation. "Your people say we are savages who kill for pleasure," Cochise said as they walked to a quiet spot overlooking the valley. "But every Apache warrior I know has lost family members to your soldiers. My own wife and daughter were killed in a cavalry attack on a peaceful camp 2 years ago. Tell me, Samuel Torres, what would you do if soldiers came to your ranch and murdered your family while you were away?" Samuel struggled with the question because he knew the honest answer. I would want revenge, he admitted. I would probably hunt down everyone responsible and kill them if I could. Cochise nodded grimly. Then, you understand why some of our young warriors cannot be controlled. They have watched their families die, and grief has made them mad with the need for vengeance. We try to direct their anger toward military targets, but sometimes they strike at any white face they see. The conversation revealed the impossible position that leaders like Red Hawk and Cochise faced. They were trying to protect their people while controlling warriors whose grief and rage made them dangerous to everyone, including themselves. Samuel began to realize that the Apache leadership was fighting a war on multiple fronts, against the army, against their own extremists, and against time itself. On his third day, Samuel was allowed to accompany a hunting party led by Red Hawk himself. The chief had decided that the white rancher needed to see the land that his people were fighting to preserve and understand what would be lost if they were forced onto reservations. The hunting expedition took them to high meadows where deer grazed among wildflowers that created carpets of color across the mountainsides. Red Hawk showed Samuel Springs where Apache families had camped for generations, their presence marked by ancient fire rings and petroglyphs carved into rock faces by ancestors long dead. "This is our church," Red Hawk explained as they rested beside a clear mountain lake. "These mountains are where we speak to our gods and where our spirits will dwell after death. The government wants to move us to flat, dry land where nothing grows and the spirits cannot find us. They say this is for our own good, that we will learn to farm and become civilized." The chief picked up a handful of the rich mountain soil, letting it run through his fingers. How can a people be civilized when they are separated from everything that gives their lives meaning? Your government would take a fish from water and tell it to be happy breathing air. Samuel was beginning to understand that this was not simply a war over territory, but a clash between two completely different ways of understanding the relationship between people and the land. To the Apache, these mountains were sacred space that could not be owned or sold. To the territorial government, they were resources to be exploited and obstacles to be overcome in the march of progress. That evening, as they prepared for what Red Hawk had said would be Samuel's final night in the camp, the chief summoned him to his shelter for a private conversation. Ayanna and Eatsell were present, along with Cochise and two elderly men who had been introduced as spiritual leaders of the band. Red Hawk wasted no time with small talk. "Tomorrow you'll be free to return to your ranch and your son. But before you go, I want you to understand the choice that awaits you." The chief gestured toward his daughters. "Ayanna and Eatsell are not just my children. They are the daughters of a chief, and in our culture that carries obligations and privileges that extend to those who save their lives. You have created a debt of honor that my family must repay." Samuel started to protest that no repayment was necessary, but Red Hawk held up his hand for silence. "I did not speak of payment, but of obligation. In Apache tradition, when someone saves the life of a chief's family member, they become part of our family. You are now bound to us as surely as if you had been born Apache." One of the elderly spiritual leaders spoke in Apache, and Red Hawk translated his words. "Many Horses says that the spirits guided you to my daughters in the desert. He believes that your arrival here, at this moment when our people face extinction, is not accident, but destiny." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What are you asking of me?" Red Hawk leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Tomorrow morning, 3 army columns will converge on these mountains. We have scouts watching their movements, and we know that they plan to attack our camp at dawn. They bring cannons and Gatling guns, and they have orders to take no prisoners. The chief paused, letting the implications sink in. We cannot win a direct battle against such forces. Our only hope is to escape through passes that only we know, leading our families to safety in Mexico, where we can rebuild our strength. Samuel's mind raced as he began to understand where this was leading. How can I help with that? The Army columns are using your neighbor, William Garrett, as a guide, Red Hawk explained. He knows these mountains well from years of hunting, and he has told the Army commanders about the main passes we might use to escape. But there's one route he does not know about, a hidden canyon that leads to the Mexican border. Red Hawk stood and walked to the entrance of the shelter, gazing out at the star-filled sky. The Army believes they have trapped us in this valley with only 3 ways out, all of which they will have blocked by morning. But they are wrong. The 4th way requires crossing your ranch. Samuel felt his world tilting as the full implications became clear. You want me to guide your people across my land? More than guide, Red Hawk said, turning back to face him. The canyon mouth is hidden on your property, but it can only be reached by passing near your house. If Army patrols see Apache crossing your ranch, they will attack immediately. We need your help to appear as something other than what we are. Cochi spoke for the first time during the meeting. We have watched your ranch for months. You run cattle and horses, and you sometimes move herds at night to avoid the heat. If soldiers see what appears to be a cattle drive in the darkness, they will not investigate closely. Samuel's mouth went dry as he realized what they were proposing. You want me to help you disguise your escape as a cattle drive? Red Hawk nodded gravely. 43 people, including 17 children. We would dress as vaqueros and scatter among your cattle. In the darkness, Army patrols would see only what they expect to see, a rancher moving his livestock. The request was staggering in its implications. If Samuel agreed, he would be actively participating in helping Apache hostiles escape military justice. If they were caught, he would be charged with treason and likely executed. Even if they escaped successfully, his involvement would eventually be discovered, and he would become a fugitive himself. But if he refused, 43 people, including children, would likely die in the morning when the Army attacked their mountain stronghold. Ayanna spoke quietly from where she sat beside her sister. I told you that Apache remember kindness. We also remember betrayal. But I do not believe you are a man who could live with the knowledge that you chose safety while children died. Samuel looked around the shelter at the faces watching him. These people had welcomed him despite their own desperate situation. They had shared their food, their stories, and their most sacred secrets with a man whose government sought their destruction. Now, they were asking him to risk everything he had built to give their children a chance at life. If I help you, Samuel said slowly, what happens to my son? What happens to our ranch? Red Hawk's expression softened slightly. Carlos will be told that his father died helping to drive cattle toward Mexico, killed by Mexican bandits near the border. His grief will be real, and no one will question his story. As for your ranch, in Apache law, it becomes the property of your son, but under our protection. No Apache will ever harm him or take anything that belongs to your family. The chief paused, then added, but you should know that if you choose this path, you can never return to your old life. The Army will eventually realize what happened, and Samuel Torres the rancher will become a wanted man. You would need to start over, probably in Mexico, with a new name and a new identity. Samuel felt the weight of the most momentous decision of his life pressing down on him. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built since arriving in Arizona, would be lost. His relationship with his son would be severed forever, based on a lie about his death. He would become a stranger in a strange land, dependent on the protection of people most whites considered enemies. But the alternative was to return to his ranch, knowing that he had chosen personal safety over the lives of innocent people. He would have to live with the knowledge that children had died while he did nothing to help them, despite having the power to save them. Red Hawk seemed to understand the magnitude of what he was asking. "I will not pressure you for an answer tonight, Samuel Torres. Sleep on your decision, and tell me your choice in the morning. Whatever you decide, you will leave here safely and return to your son." As Samuel lay awake that night, staring up at the star-filled sky above the hidden valley, he thought about the chain of events that had brought him to this moment. It had started with a simple choice to offer water to two dying women. That single act of mercy had led him step by step to a crossroads where he must choose between two different versions of himself. He could choose to be Samuel Torres the rancher, a man who had once shown kindness to strangers but who ultimately prioritized his own security and that of his family. Or he could choose to become someone whose commitment to doing what was right transcended considerations of personal cost. As dawn approached and the time for his decision drew near, Samuel realized that Red Hawk had been right about one thing. His life had already been forever changed by helping Ayanna and Itzel. The only question now was whether he would see that change through to its logical conclusion or spend the rest of his life wondering what kind of man he might have been if he had found the courage to risk everything for his principles. Samuel woke before dawn on what would be the most important day of his life. The Apache camp was already stirring with quiet, purposeful activity as families prepared for what everyone knew would be a desperate flight for survival. Children were being dressed in their warmest clothes, and warriors were checking weapons and gathering the few possessions they could carry during a hasty retreat. Red Hawk found Samuel sitting beside the dying embers of the fire, where he had spent a sleepless night wrestling with his conscience. The Apache chief looked older in the gray pre-dawn light. The weight of leadership and the knowledge of approaching danger etched deeply in the lines of his weathered face. "Have you reached your decision, Samuel Torres?" the chief asked quietly, settling down beside the fire. Samuel looked at the man who had become both his captor and his host, seeing in Red Hawk's eyes the same mixture of hope and resignation that he had noticed in Ayanna's face when he first offered her water in the desert. These were people who had learned not to expect mercy from fate, but who still dared to hope for it. "I have," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to commit to. "I will help your people escape." Red Hawk nodded slowly, showing neither relief nor surprise. "I thought you would choose honor over safety. It is written in your actions, not your words." The chief stood and called softly to Cochise, who approached with several other warriors. In rapid Apache, Red Hawk began issuing orders that would set their desperate plan in motion. Samuel caught enough to understand that scouts were being sent to monitor army movements, while other warriors were assigned to begin moving the band's horses and essential supplies toward the valley's hidden exit. "We must reach your ranch before full daylight," Red Hawk explained to Samuel. "Our scouts report that the army columns are in position and will begin their attack on this valley within 2 hours. They believe we are trapped here, and they plan to use their cannons to blast us from the caves where they think we will try to hide." Samuel felt a chill as he realized how close these people had come to annihilation. If not for their request for his help, 43 Apache would have been sleeping peacefully when artillery shells began falling on their camp. The escape began immediately. Apache families moved like ghosts through the pre-dawn darkness, following paths that seemed to exist only in their collective memory. Samuel was amazed by their ability to move so many people, including small children, through treacherous mountain terrain without making any sound that might alert army sentries posted around the valley's known exits. Ayanna and Eatzel stayed close to Samuel throughout the descent, their presence serving as both protection and reminder of why he had chosen this path. Despite her injured ankle, Eatzel moved with remarkable grace over the rocky terrain, and Samuel realized that she had inherited her father's natural ability to navigate these mountains with instinctive skill. The hidden canyon that would lead them to safety was indeed concealed on Samuel's property, its mouth disguised by a rockfall that appeared natural, but had actually been carefully arranged by Apache hands generations earlier. Red Hawk explained that his people had been using this escape route for over a century, but they had never before needed to rely on a white man's cooperation to access it. As they approached the area near Samuel's ranch house, the logistical challenges of their plan became apparent. The Apache families would need to remain hidden while Samuel gathered his cattle and positioned them for the fake cattle drive that would mask their escape. The timing would be critical. Too early, and Army patrols might investigate the unusual nighttime activity. Too late, and dawn would expose their deception. Samuel left the Apache hidden in an arroyo near his property line and rode home alone, his mind racing with the details of what needed to happen next. He found Carlos waiting anxiously in the kitchen, having worried through the night about his father's unexplained absence. "Papa, where have you been?" Carlos demanded in Spanish. His relief at seeing his father safely returned mixed with anger at being left without explanation. Samuel embraced his son, knowing that this might be the last time they would see each other. The weight of what he was about to do pressed heavily on his chest, but there was no time for sentiment or second thoughts. "Mijo, I need you to listen carefully," Samuel said, switching to English to ensure there was no misunderstanding. "There are some problems with Mexican bandits near the border, and I need to move our cattle to safety tonight. I want you to stay in the house, and do not come outside no matter what you hear, understand?" Carlos frowned, sensing that something was being left unsaid. "Why can't I help? We have always worked together when there is danger." Samuel's heart ached as he looked at his son's earnest face. "Because this is different, Carlos. This time I need you to trust me and stay safe. If anything happens to me, you know that the Hendersons have always been good neighbors. Go to them, and they will help you contact your aunt in Tucson." The young man's frown deepened. "Papa, you are scaring me. What is really happening?" Before Samuel could answer, the distant sound of artillery fire echoed across the desert from the direction of the Dragoon Mountains. The army had begun their attack on the Apache camp, not knowing that their targets had already escaped. Samuel grabbed his son's shoulders. "Promise me you will stay inside, Carlos. Promise me on your mother's memory." Carlos nodded reluctantly, confused and frightened by his father's intensity. Samuel kissed his son's forehead, then turned and walked quickly toward the barn, knowing that if he looked back his resolve might crumble. The next hour was the most intense of Samuel's life. He saddled Luna and 2 other horses, then began gathering his scattered cattle using techniques he had perfected over years of ranching. The cattle were accustomed to being moved at night during the hottest months, so they responded to his calls and whistles without unusual agitation. As he worked, Apache families began emerging from their hiding place and integrating themselves among the cattle. The transformation was remarkable. Within minutes, what had been a band of desperate refugees became what appeared to be Mexican vaqueros helping with a routine cattle drive. The Apache had somehow acquired appropriate clothing and equipment, and even their posture and movements had changed to match their disguised identities. Red Hawk approached Samuel as the last of his people took their positions among the cattle. The chief had transformed himself into what looked like an experienced ranch foreman, complete with a wide-brimmed hat and leather chaps that concealed his traditional Apache clothing. "My people are ready," he said quietly. "But before we begin, I want you to know that what you are doing tonight will be remembered in Apache stories for generations to come. Your name will be spoken with honor around our fires long after both of us have joined our ancestors." Samuel nodded, touched by the chief's words, but focused on the immediate challenges ahead. "How long will it take to reach the canyon?" 2 hours if we maintain the pace of cattle. The canyon entrance is disguised as a box canyon that appears to dead end against the mountain. Your neighbors know it as a place where cattle sometimes get trapped. So if anyone sees us entering it, they will think we are simply retrieving stranded animals. The fake cattle drive began as the first hint of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon. Samuel took the lead position, playing his role as the rancher moving his livestock to new pasture. Behind him, Apache families moved among the cattle with the skill of people who had been working with animals their entire lives. Ayana and Itzel rode near the middle of the group, both now dressed as young vaqueros helping with the drive. In the dim light, even Samuel had to look carefully to distinguish them from what they were pretending to be. Their transformation was so complete that he began to understand how the Apache had managed to survive decades of military pursuit. As they crossed his property toward the hidden canyon, Samuel spotted dust clouds on the horizon that marked the movement of army units. The soldiers were racing toward the Dragoon Mountains to participate in what they believed would be the final destruction of Red Hawk's band. Samuel felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that they would find only empty caves and cold fire pits. The most dangerous moment came when they encountered a cavalry patrol that was rushing toward the mountains to join the attack. The sergeant in charge of the patrol called out to Samuel, asking if he had seen any Apache movement in the area. Samuel's heart pounded as he answered in his most casual voice. "Nothing unusual, Sergeant. Just moving some cattle before the day gets too hot. You boys heading to the excitement in the mountains?" The sergeant nodded grimly. "Red Hawk's band is trapped up there. This should be the end of him and his murderous followers." He glanced at the cattle drive with mild interest. "Good idea to get your stock clear of the area. Things might get messy when we start using the cannons." Samuel managed a nod of agreement while praying that the sergeant would not look too closely at his vaqueros. In the growing daylight, their disguises might not hold up to careful scrutiny. After what felt like an eternity, the patrol rode on toward the mountains. Samuel allowed himself a moment of relief before refocusing on the task at hand. They were almost to the canyon entrance, but the most critical phase of their plan was still ahead. The hidden canyon proved to be exactly as Red Hawk had described, a narrow opening between towering rock walls that appeared to end in a dead-end cliff face. Samuel had ridden past this spot many times without realizing that it concealed a secret passage through the mountains. Once the cattle and their Apache escorts were inside the canyon, the transformation back to their true identities began immediately. The disguises were abandoned, traditional clothing was retrieved from hidden packs, and weapons were redistributed among the warriors. Red Hawk approached Samuel one final time before the band continued their journey toward Mexico. "This is where we must part company, my friend. You have fulfilled your obligation to my family, and we release you from any further duty to our cause." Samuel looked at the Apache chief, knowing that this moment would define the rest of his life. He could turn around, ride back to his ranch, and tell Carlos some story about the cattle drive. He could resume his old life as if nothing had happened, except for the knowledge that he carried about this night. where he could continue forward into the unknown, leaving everything familiar behind, but remaining true to the principles that had guided his actions. "No," Samuel said quietly. "My obligation is not to your family, but to what I believe is right. These children deserve a chance to grow up free, and I want to see that they get that chance." Red Hawk's eyes widened slightly. The first time Samuel had seen the Apache chief show genuine surprise. "You would abandon your son and your ranch to stay with us?" Samuel thought of Carlos, probably still waiting anxiously in the house, wondering when his father would return. The pain of that separation would be the price he paid for remaining true to his conscience. "I would rather have my son believe his father died with honor than live knowing his father was a coward," Samuel replied. "Carlos is strong and smart. He will survive and build his own life. But if I go back now, I will never be the man he deserves as a father." As the sun rose over the Arizona mountains, Samuel Torres made the choice that would transform him from a simple rancher into a legend among the Apache people. He turned Luna toward the hidden passage that led to Mexico, leaving behind his old life and embracing an uncertain future guided only by his commitment to protecting the innocent. Behind them, artillery shells continued to fall on empty caves while soldiers searched for an enemy that was already beyond their reach. The army would eventually discover that Red Hawk's band had escaped, and they would piece together the truth about how it had been accomplished. Samuel's ranch would be confiscated as the property of traitor. Carlos would be told that his father had been killed by Mexican bandits while pursuing stolen cattle. The young man would grieve for a father who was actually alive, but could never contact him again. But 43 Apache people, including 17 children, would live to see another sunrise. They would preserve their culture and their stories, including a new story about the white rancher who risked everything to give them a chance at freedom. Years later, when Apache elders gathered around fires to share the stories that defined their people, they would speak of Samuel Torres with the same reverence they reserved for their greatest warriors. They would tell of his choice to value honor over safety, principle over comfort, and the lives of strangers over his own security. And in those stories, his legacy would live forever, proof that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can change the course of history itself. 7.